and this almost looks like a blind alley. So to me it seems that rather than to focus on children, as the young people, 5 or 25, I would focus on the voters and on the psychology of voting, and try to figure out why people vote against their interests. And if you speak about implementation, maybe the implementation in the US to guarantee equality of casting votes, so that the underprivileged people have a chance to vote as well as the more privileged.
Well, thank you. That's a really great comment, I guess. First of all, I would say it's not either or, that we need better solutions if we want, and we need to know more about which solutions work if we are to enact policies that are successful. So I think that's one piece of it, but I absolutely agree with all the other things that you said. We are working with a group called Opportunity Agenda, which is a nonprofit organization in New York City whose mission is to help organizations communicate about progressive causes, so getting the word out. Unequal political participation would absolutely be within our agenda. We would support research on how to reduce inequality in political participation. When we say academic, social, behavioral, and economic outcomes, that would fall under the behavioral outcomes, so we would definitely be interested in that. When we talk about reducing inequality in education or in the labor market, of course this is part of a much larger system of inequality, and there are structural forces that present it. I think you go a little too far to say that politicians could not care less. There's variation among politicians, and we have found politicians on the left as well as on the right who are interested, or who are at least willing to provide the rhetoric about, to speak about reducing inequality. For example, Paul Ryan, who is a Republican congressman, former candidate for vice president, has called for creating an evidence commission or something like that, a commission that would evaluate research evidence to help make decisions about social programs. So that seems to be a positive development. We are also supporting research by Robert Putnam. Oh, I forgot to come back to Robert Putnam. Okay, so Robert Putnam became famous for this idea about social capital. He wrote the book Bowling Alone to show how our society is fragmenting. So he just had a new book that came out called Our Kids. And it's about the rise in inequality and the lack of opportunity. And his goal now is to get this information in front of every politician and confront every candidate for the 2016 presidential election and challenge the candidates to respond. And he has excellent access. He has a long relationship with the Clintons, but he also has a relationship with Jeb Bush and his team and with other potential candidates. So there's a good chance that he'll be able to do this. But he needs more concrete programs and policies to lay before these politicians. And so we, the William P. Grant Foundation and the Ford Foundation, are supporting a series of task forces that he has organized in early childhood, in K through 12 education, in neighborhood, in family stability, and in the transition to the labor force, to identify promising or proven programs that these politicians can choose among. And of course, they will choose the ones that fit their ideological predispositions. Jeb Bush is not going to pick taxing the rich. But there are other approaches that would be compatible. Finally, I would say in response to your comment, which again I agree with, that's why we have another focus on the use of research evidence. And we have found we have some findings. The researchers that we've supported have come up with findings that are very relevant to your comment. We are trying to convince researchers that they have to move away from dissemination, where a researcher figures something out and tells everybody and thinks something's going to happen, to a model of engagement, where there's a long-term relationship between researchers or other intermediaries and decision makers, whether it's a partnership between university researchers and a school district, or a trusted intermediary that engages with political staff about policy effects. Either of these engagement approaches are more likely to be successful than the dissemination model that has so long characterized the way researchers think about getting the word out. So I think your comment is well taken, but there are responses.
Thank you very much.
Pedro, it's for social economic analysis. You know, we have been working together on education and equality for many years. So for you, it's rewarding to work with a country where politicians are probably listening to what you present as a result from the research. On the other hand, there are missed two really big issues which are now new in this field. One, which was presented in two works recently published by two completely different scholars. One, Charles Murray, Coming Apart. And major argument of his book is that there's a cognitive elite being created, and basically challenging our common view that is a socioeconomic status, which explains inequality and access to higher education. Now, from our field, Guy Marx, his challenging book saying, forget about socioeconomic status, it is IQ, and we have absolutely no control over the effect of IQ unless we implement really deep reforms in the educational system. Because if you fight inequality based on socioeconomic status, it's possible. Basically, it's not hopeless. But if it's IQ, how would you fight that factor which is deeply in people, is reproduced by, so to say, that genetically, first. Second issue is failing boys. It's a big issue in inequality in education, as you know, especially in the United States. Young men are failing in getting hired in education, failing in labor market, and even failing in creating motivations to compete with women. So how would you explain, not only, we know the causes, basically, right? But they have been explained. But what might be the consequences in the future, because this trend is really strong. And I'm really interested in your...
Yeah, those are two great questions, two very different questions, so I'll take them one at a time. First, the question is, what if IQ or cognitive ability lies behind the inequalities that we're seeing? Aren't we then stuck? Aren't we then trying to swim upstream if we think we can attack the problem by improving mobility, by improving socioeconomic standing? If they were still stuck with the cognitive ability differences, then what can we do? Now, I've not read either of the two books, but I'm certainly familiar with the work of, I'm familiar with the books, and I'm familiar with the past work of Charles Murray, and I know this is something of a new direction for Gary Marx. But my answer is the same now as it has been in the past, which is that IQ is not a fixed phenomenon. IQ is malleable. This is demonstrable. So if there are cognitive inequalities that underlie the different trajectories that people from different social and economic backgrounds are taking, this is not something that should prevent us from acting. In fact, I think all of the responses to inequality that I described are appropriate, even if Charles Murray is correct, descriptively correct. Now, he's not correct in diagnosing cognitive differences as preceding, as fundamental to economic and racial and ethnic differences. Cognitive differences are largely a response, not a source of social and economic differences. But we don't have to have that debate, in my opinion. We don't have to have that debate in order to answer your question, which is, what can we do about it? Because I think that the earned income tax credit which helps lift families out of poverty. Small classes in the early elementary grades, which helps especially African American children. Family engagement programs, which helps children from disadvantaged backgrounds by engaging their parents in school and positioning their parents better to advocate for their schooling success. I think each of these and all the other strategies I presented is no less, has no less potential to be successful, whether we're talking about socioeconomic divisions or cognitive divisions. And I think that the fundamental basis for maintaining this position is that IQ and cognitive ability are not fixed commodities, but rather they can be molded through experience. If they were fixed, we wouldn't see people's IQ change over their lifetime, and it's long been demonstrated. Similarly, there is an inheritance component to IQ, but it is small compared to the effects of experience. So we can, what we're born with is not where genetics are not destiny. I guess one more comment about that is we're learning more and more about the relation between genes and environment. We're learning more and more that environments trigger the operation of genes. And so even if genetic endowments are fundamental to our success, how those genetic endowments play out in our long term are affected by the environment, and so we can modify the environment. So for all these reasons, I would say neither Murray nor Marx's work fundamentally challenges the response that I've identified, even if there's disagreements over what the foundations for the inequality is. Now, with respect to the second question about boys, again, you're absolutely right. I'm a great supporter of President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative, which is an initiative to support the development of African American male young people. I think it's extremely important. In almost all the indicators of inequality that I put up having to do with education and labor market, you would find African American males struggling more than any other group. It's also true that females are ahead of males in the education system in almost all indicators. Grades, test scores, graduating high school, enrolling in college, completing college. Only in a few scientific domains, physics and engineering, do men still show an advantage over women. Those happen to be highly remunerative. They pay off well in the labor market. But in education, women are advantaged over men in almost all areas. But in the labor market, men still have the advantage, not only because of their greater persistence in the labor market, but also men just get paid more for the same work. So, it's not all about women's advantage, but it's a big part of the story. And we need, so I said very briefly that we need to better understand how programs work differently in different places and for different people. So this would be, the gender dimension would be one aspect. At the William T. Grant Foundation, we'd especially be interested in how gender intersects with low income status or with racial and ethnic minority status or immigrant status. So we wouldn't focus so much on gender in isolation, but African American males, for example, would be a great target for research. So that's how I think we need to address this.
We have a lot of time for questions. I'm Philip Ramesh, and I work with the Open Society Foundation, Jewish Foundation's research funds in the Czech Republic. I just wanted to ask you if you have any good practice examples where the results of your research have been implemented in the public policies or affected the public policies, and if you have any positive good experience, how you have achieved this, how to produce the evidence-based policies.
Yes, so there are fewer examples than I would like, but there are examples, and some of these examples are successful, and some are failures. Perhaps the best example is described in a book written by a guy named Ron Haskins. Ron Haskins is a former Republican congressional staff member, and he wrote a book about welfare reform in the 1990s in the United States. Now, so the story of welfare reform is we used to have a welfare system where mothers with single mothers with children could get a government handout. And there was widespread agreement that this was not a good system. It was very expensive. It didn't incentivize women to get ahead. It created dependencies. There was a lot of agreement that this was not likely to succeed. So what the federal government did was it granted waivers to states. By waivers, I mean they were not required to stick to government federal regulations. They could pass out the welfare money in alternate ways. So this created a lot of experimentation among states, but there was one requirement. They had to do a rigorous evaluation, including randomized evaluation, of the effects of welfare reform. And sure enough, some of the welfare reforms, particularly just by coincidence, I had nothing to do with it, but by coincidence in the state of Wisconsin, it was very successful welfare reform, which targeted the welfare payments more narrowly, which required the young women either to work or either to find a job or to get more education, and which limited the time that you could get the welfare payments to 2 years. So eventually something like the Wisconsin model was adopted on a national basis.